There we go. Okay, hi, I'm Nguyen, and my project is discussing how California's anti-Japanese sentiments influence U.S. foreign policy post-World War I. So a little bit of background, with the current climate and a lot of anti-Asian hate social movements going on, I began to wonder how a lot of my relatives, family members, and friends were kind of unaware of the anti-Asian racism that once plagued California. Um, from what I've learned throughout high school and even into college, a lot of the anti-Japanese racism during the 20th century is greatly forgotten. For the most part, we tend to skip towards Japanese internment during World War II and kind of just forget how we got to there. So I really wanted to uncover how this all occurred, who was really involved, and kind of what was the bigger picture about that. So if you guys look on the right real quickly, we have a comic called The Yellow Peril, which is a very big comic that kind of started circulation in 1899. It depicts a Chinese man obviously holding a smoking gun and knife in his mouth and essentially walking over a deceased white American woman. This kind of served as a metaphor for how Asian immigration could serve as an existential threat to the United States. Obviously, that's a very racist and negative, overtone of Asian Americans. So my methodology for our research, I started with archival research, going through the Bancroft Library Archives at UC Berkeley. Two collections I really focus on are of two very prominent figures who I'll touch on shortly, Hiram Johnson and James Phelan. Their collections include their personal notes, diaries, documents, a lot of letters sent towards them. These two men were prominent anti-Japanese politicians, and it was very interesting kind of going through their works and kind of getting primary sources and get a glimpse into their minds as they worked in office. Secondly, I went through congressional records of both the Senate and House proceedings, especially during, I kind of surrounded my research around times where very tumultuous events occurred in California, and kind of try to see how the transition and perspectives of these politicians kind of shifted over time towards a more negative overview of Japanese people. Furthermore, I went through a lot of newspaper databases. I've been through a lot of newspapers, both physically and digitally, especially through the LA Times and through the UC Riverside newspaper database, to kind of search through specific how newspapers were covering certain events, what some certain perspectives of the journalists and kind of how their Japanese people were being depicted at the time, and if any actual Japanese people were able to respond to any sort of their hatred in the media at the time. So during my research, I found two major players in the anti-Japanese movement in California, beginning with Hiram Johnson, who was a progressive and later a Republican. He was California's governor from 1911 to 1917 and played a very prominent role in the legalization and passing of a lot of anti-Japanese legislation. Furthermore, a little anecdote, he ran as the vice presidential candidate along with Teddy Roosevelt during their Bull Moose Run in 1912, and he served a very prominent role as a California senator from 1917 to 1945. His counterpart, James Phelan, a Democrat, was San Francisco's mayor from 1897 to 1902, and Johnson's senatorial partner from 1915 to 1921. What I really wanted to push is that these anti-Japanese sentiments weren't just solely on party lines. As you can see, both Phelan and Johnson were from opposing parties. However, they held staunch anti-Japanese sentiments, which were pretty much a California issue. Going into my initial findings on my research, I found that there was multi-level systematic racism. Beginning in locally, one of the most prominent was education segregation in San Francisco, where a lot of white children and Japanese children were in classes together. However, once a white family were to complain and kind of protest in the school board, they would be forced to segregate those children. However, after the school board of San Francisco decided that in 1907, it would be too costly to establish a whole new school for these immigrants, that they were simply going to keep them in these schools. A lot of white Americans across the Pacific coast, beginning in San Francisco, all the way up to Seattle, all the way up to Washington, and even into British Columbia and Canada, started to riot and in hopes to intimidate both the school board and, more importantly, Japanese families into somewhat staying and hiding and or pulling their kids out of school and potentially even moving back to Japan. On a state level, especially here in Riverside, the Alien Land Law in 1913 barred non-citizens and those who cannot become citizens from owning land. This, as some of us know, the Hirata House here in Riverside was a very important house, and there was a case involving that family suing actually the state of California and allowing them to own land. This kind of came about after multiple loopholes were found in the alien land law. For example, families would, their parents were not able to own land. However, since their children were born in this country, they were technically citizens. And after multiple loopholes were found, California decided to act and chose to close off those loopholes. More importantly, Hiram Johnson, who was governor after the original land law passed in 1913, tasked his attorney general with staunchly and harshly prosecuting those who were in a violation of the law. Federally, the Gentlemen's Agreement in 1907 ended the Pacific Coast riots, and it kind of established this whole deal between Japan and the United States, where the government of Japan would agree to limit emigration from their country as much as possible by limiting passports and visas. And in return, the United States and Canada decided, or not decided to, but they'd rather agreed to, in paper at least, treating Japanese people fairly and equally. However, as we can see based off this timeline here in 1907 and then 1913, 20, and 23, this was not the case. This is kind of the first instance where Japanese equality was on the table, and it took a more broad stance following World War I with the rejection of the Japanese Equality Clause following the First World War, where the Japanese delegation simply requested to be treated fairly and equally in the eyes of the international community without any regard to race or nationality. However, that was rejected by President Wilson and the other members of that council. Johnson and Phelan played very strong roles in influencing Johnson's decision. Both Phelan and Johnson greatly disliked Japanese people and felt that the Japanese Empire's ambitions and request to be seen as equal was downright unacceptable. This eventually led to the Immigration Act of 1924, where immigration quotas greatly limited how many immigrants from Asia and Southeast Asia were allowed into this country. This was a very prominent immigration act, and it really limited how many people from these cultures could really come into the country solely based on the fact that they were seen as inferior and could potentially create a secret invasion that could damage the very fabric of the United States. The broader implications of my research include how the anti-Japanese efforts really played in the racial overtones of the 20th century. This was a really understated and undertaught piece of California or the United States racism history. For example, racial equality was the big issue here, and seeing as though the Japanese only requested to be seen as equal could very threaten how the United States conducted itself. As we know, this is during a time where segregation was very prominent in the South, and if the United States or California were to show that they were to treat Japanese people fairly, they must also treat African Americans fairly, and that would essentially damage the whole fact that, separate but equal argument, which is very sad. Furthermore, during this time, Western and white imperial powers, for example, the United Kingdom, United States, were growing. However, they were the only ones that felt that they would be allowed to grow. In other words, they felt that we're allowed to have an empire. However, these Asians and these other inferior people cannot. Furthermore, today, California is seen as a very progressive and liberal and social equity state. However, this was not always the case. California has had a very, very dark past that is often overlooked and kind of ignored, especially during the education system. And I feel like this should really be a topic that they should really discuss more so than just the internment of Japanese during World War II. Kind of understanding how there was multi-level racism against the Japanese throughout the 20th century really helps us understand how Californians did not oppose the executive order 9066 by President Roosevelt at the time, which called for the Japanese internment in concentration camps during World War II. Before, a lot, at least for me, when I was in school, I would always question how people could just stand by as others were just thrown into these prisons. However, now I'm able to understand, hopefully more people are able to understand how this came about.
Okay, well done, well done.
And acknowledgements real quickly. Dr. Cosgrove, thank you so much for being my faculty mentor, helping me throughout this process. Thank you to the history department for helping me get to where I need to be. And thank you to the UCR mini grant program for funding my trip to Berkeley and helping me further my research. So yeah, thank you guys.
Okay, questions, anyone? Got about 4 minutes. Well, I'll start the ball rolling. I wonder if you could just talk for a bit more, help me understand. I'm sure it didn't take much, but what were the if you talk to white Californians, then what was their beef with Japanese Americans?
A lot of their beef started with how many of them saw Japanese farmers as threats to their very existence. For example, the growth of Japanese farmers and their families, more and more of them coming into the country, kind of showed white Americans that, hey, there is a chance for us to be outnumbered in the future. There could be a quote unquote secret invasion of these people coming in mass, at least, and taking over not only our jobs, but our lands and solely outnumbering us. Obviously, this would have never been the case, as that would take millions and millions and millions of people to come. However, it was kind of a blowing smoke moment. So yeah, they're just xenophobic fears and just racial undertones of just, hey, they're here, they're gonna kill us, they don't like us, they want to take over our lands, they want to destroy our country and kind of make California Japanese.
Yeah. How many are there at their peak? I mean, are there millions or something?
So far from what I've heard in my research is about a couple 100,000 spread across the Bay and into Southern California. This number kind of increased during right before and kind of during the First World War, when a lot of farmers were needed to kind of push the war effort and help the United States win. And yeah, that's when it really started growing. But after 1924, the numbers decreased greatly.
Wow. Okay. All right. Thank you. Anyone else? Questions? Okay, then. Well, I'd like to urge us all a round of applause for Kyle. Well done. Yay.